and the Open Pandora stuck out. And the Open Pandora stuck out. Why am I saying stuck out? Now, as you can see, well, there you go. When you flip it open, it'll stay where you put it until you... One of the first things you'll notice when you do load a game is how bright and clear the screen is. And you can see here how... Coming up, the best retro gaming device you've never heard of. We're getting our game on old school. The first season of B Squared starts right now. Greetings and welcome to the first installment of the all-new B Squared. This is our opportunity to just take a break from day-to-day life and talk about things that are interesting. Or should I say things that I hope are interesting. Now, while I have a list of topics that I want to cover, what this ultimately becomes depends largely on you. At the end of each episode, I'll turn to the camera and say, that's what I think, but what do you think? Drop a comment below and let's chat. I want to hear from you, what you like, what you don't like, and what you think about what you see and hear. Now, before we go on, I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge some of my favorite YouTube creators for giving me the courage and inspiration to give this a go. Big shout-outs to DGR, Freakin' Geek, Leto's Law, LGR, Louis Rossman, Schrodinger's Cat, and Tow Trucker, among many others. You guys and gals keep up the great work. Now, to my viewers, after you like and subscribe here, go and have a look at those other channels and give them a like and subscribe as well. I promise you won't be disappointed, and I know they'd appreciate it as well. And now, without further ado, let's have a look at our first bit of content. Nowadays, when you think of video gaming, what probably comes to mind is modern-day super classics like Super Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild. Titles with super polished open worlds, symphonic music, and the latest in 3D characters. But once upon a time, video games were almost comically simple by comparison. 8-bit sprites, music that was basically a MIDI track, and backgrounds that reused the same sprites to save memory. While in the last decade or so, retro gaming has started to make a comeback, just look at how many classic games are being re-released for modern platforms. For most of the 90s and 2000s, it was just a memory, unless of course you still had your old hardware. And then, along came the Open Pandora. Developed in Germany and released around 2010, the design packed an impressive array of features into a device that could fit in the palm of your hand. The first version sold for €370, or a little over $430 US. Out of the box, the Pandora sported a number of premium features, including a touchscreen, Wi-Fi, a full-sized USB port, a full QWERTY keyboard, analog nubs, not kidding, that's what they're called, shoulder buttons, a hefty 10-hour battery, and they even came with a stylus that bears a striking resemblance to what the Wii U would have a few years down the road. In terms of software, it ran a custom build of Linux, but you could run your own version or even Android if you wanted to. The build that came pre-installed was fully functional though, and it could run just about anything that was compatible with Linux. That meant that with the right apps installed, you could use your Open Pandora as a fully functional PDA if you wanted to. But today, let's have a look at how the Open Pandora functions in its intended capacity as a gaming device. So I actually got my first Open Pandora back in 2012, and it was during what you might call a gadget phase. See, in those days I was traveling a lot and needed something to keep myself occupied on plane rides, road trips, and so on. The Pandora seemed like the one-size-fits-all answer when I came across it. Now by that point I had already amassed a bit of a collection, with a Sony Palm Top, 2 Microsoft Zunes, I even had a Nook Color if you can believe that, and the Nook probably saw the most use out of everything I owned, if only because reading is probably the least stressful thing you can do while you're traveling. Just saying. Anyway, I came across the Open Pandora more or less by accident. See, I was comparison shopping with the Palm Top that I already had just to see what else was out there. And the Open Pandora stuck out because it had a unique design. So I thought, you know what the heck? Looks interesting, and what have you got to lose anyway? So I placed the order and waited for it to show up. Now I will freely admit that the Open Pandora was more or less an impulse buy, and I did not do my homework before I placed the order. Turns out that they run on a modified version of Linux, and being a lifelong Windows guy, that made me a little nervous. Turns out I was worrying over nothing. Out of the box, there wasn't a lot of setup required, and as for Linux, turns out it doesn't really have a steep learning curve after all. Now, I know there are Linux people out there saying, yeah, and in other news, the sky is blue. Well, you're right. Once I got hold of a couple of emulators, I was up and gaming in almost no time. So what's the user experience? Well, before we dive into that, I should probably clarify that this is actually my second Open Pandora from 2013, the 1 GHz Open Pandora Platinum, which seems appropriate given its color, and that all of my performance-related comments are specific to this version. So with that said, let's talk about how the Open Pandora handles. The first thing you'll notice is that the boot cycle is incredibly fast, and you can dive into gameplay pretty much as soon as the menu comes up. Now, one of the first things you'll notice when you do load a game is how bright and clear the screen is. Now, this is from a time before LED screens were really a thing, and as LCDs go, this actually seems to be one of the better displays you'll run into. To this day, I'm still amazed that there isn't really any motion smear to speak of, and you can see how terrific this one looks, even after 8 years of use. Now, unfortunately, the speakers aren't nearly as good, but it's nothing that can't be solved with a good set of earbuds, because the Pandora does have a really good sound card. Now, in terms of gameplay, if you're emulating an older system like the classic 8-bit Nintendo, the games are basically just as smooth as they were on the original hardware, if not better. But you'll notice the device is shaped differently than one of those classic controllers, which means you'll have to get used to a different key layout. But you can compensate by customizing your button mapping if you need to. And as an added bonus, remember when we were playing all those classic games as kids, and when we stopped, we'd have to start all over again from scratch the next time? A lot of emulators solve that by letting you save and load states anytime you wanted to. That was handy. The experience was pretty much the same when you were emulating a later system like the Super Nintendo, which used 16-bit graphics instead of 8. Side-scrollers tended to give you the best frame rate, while games that used Mode 7 graphics like Mario Kart or Pilot Wings tended to be hit or miss. Now, as far as controls are concerned, systems like the Super Nintendo tended to have control schemes that were a little more complicated, so the Open Pandora's layout could take some getting used to. Hit or miss was also the experience when emulating one of the later 64-bit systems, and this, unfortunately, is where some of the Open Pandora's limitations began to make themselves known. First, the shape of the N64 controller was vastly different than anything that had come before it, and those controls don't always translate well to the Pandora's layout. I found myself dying and taking damage a lot, even in games that I'd mastered as far back as 1997, because I didn't have those trusty yellow C buttons to fall back on. The Pandora also doesn't have a dedicated trigger, which can result in some interesting key mapping for certain games. Frame rate could also be an issue, especially if there were a lot of layers or a lot of shaders on the screen at the same time. Things like fire and smoke could slow things to a crawl, and unfortunately, it tended to happen more often on the Pandora than it did on the original hardware. Now, from a hardware perspective, the Open Pandora is both well designed and well assembled. That said, no device is perfect, and the Pandora does have a couple of minor issues. The first one, which you may have seen me dealing with throughout this video, is the screen hinge. Now, for the most part, it'll stay where you put it, but as you see, it can snap down into a 90-degree position without much warning, especially if you get jostled. It can happen suddenly, and if it happens at an inopportune moment during gameplay, say during a boss fight, it can cost you a life. Now, this wasn't really a problem with the first Pandora, so I can only assume it's something unique to this version. The second issue is something a little more common to portable devices even today, and that's that the charge port can be a bit of a challenge to plug into. The Pandora ships with a hybrid charge cable with multiple tips for different devices. The one the Pandora uses is this one, the yellow 1.7mm barrel jack. When you plug in, it can take a bit of doing to get it to connect and actually start charging, and it can be just as much a challenge to keep it connected once it's in. Now, I recently learned, yes, after owning these things for 8 years, that what I had thought was a proprietary video out port here on the back is actually an on-the-go USB input port, not unlike the ones you'd find on a PSP. What that means is you can use a PSP cable to charge off USB if you need to. But the drawback is the USB port pulls in less power than the AC port does, so it'll take longer to charge your Pandora via USB, and it might not charge at all if you're using the system at the same time, because the power requirements for the Pandora itself are higher than what the USB port can pull in. One final note about the Open Pandora before we wrap up. If you visit the manufacturer's website at openpandora.org, you'll see that these have been out of production since 2013. There's actually a successor on the way in the form of the DragonBox Pyra. The new system boasts some nifty new features, including a larger screen and a full-sized HDMI port. Now, as I record this in October 2021, The Pyra is due to be released any day now. I actually have one on pre-order, so as soon as it gets here, I'll do a follow-up video. And there you have it. Everything you wanted to know but were afraid to ask about the Open Pandora. What's your take on all this? Were you impressed with the Pandora? Would you consider buying a Pyra? Drop a comment below and let's chat. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Brandon Bridges reminding you the best way to be is B squared. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
TNPIR 4002 says, screw Flanders.